The late autumn sun was streaming through the windows of the Wilson family's old home, casting a soft light across the modest room. Lilia was sitting on a small couch, holding the invitation to her own wedding, made of expensive gold-embossed paper. It stood in stark contrast to the simplicity of her surroundings. The room, with its old furniture, felt not only modest but also warm, a testament to her family's years of hard work. Her mother, Elizabeth, quietly came and sat down next to her. Her eyes were a mixture of pride and concern. "Lilia, are you sure you want to do this?" she asked, touching her daughter's hand. Her voice was filled with concern. "The Graham family is not like us. You remember how they looked at us last time, don't you?" Lilia sighed, remembering the cold reception at the large Graham estate when she first met the parents of her fiancé, Oliver. They were cold, formal, and their eyes were full of disdain. But Oliver was different. He was her support, her light in the darkness. "Mom, Oliver is not like them. He loves me because of who I am," she said, though there was a faint tinge of doubt in her voice. The door of the old house creaked open as George, Lilia's father, entered. His face was wrinkled from years of hard work in the factory, and his eyes showed constant fatigue. He took off his old hat and placed it on a table that had seen better days. "What do the family say?" he asked, looking at his daughter with a heavy heart. Lilia felt her heart begin to clench. "The Grahams," she trailed off, noticing the change in his expression. "Dad, what's wrong?" George sat down heavily in his chair, avoiding eye contact with his daughter. "Today at the factory, Mr. Graham called me into his office," he began, his voice echoing in the silence of the room. "He said that if I authorized this marriage, would be fired from my job." Silence covered the room like a thick blanket. Lilia felt the ground parting under her feet. The reality that had separated her family from the Grahams suddenly seemed like an inescapable chasm. "They can't do this," she whispered as anger and helplessness began to boil in her chest. Elizabeth took her husband's hand, her eyes sparkling with determination. "We will find a way. We always do," she said, squeezing his fingers. But as Lilia looked at the shiny invitation paper, she suddenly felt her dreams begin to seem like a mockery of her own life. She swore that nothing and no one would stand in the way of her happiness, not knowing what events would unfold next. The day Lilia first met Oliver, her life changed. She remembered working in a flower shop when he walked in, tall, with penetrating eyes and a warm smile. He was placing an order for his mother, but their eyes crossed, and it was like a lightning strike. "Good afternoon, I'm Oliver," he said, and his voice made Lilia's heart skip a beat. "Do you work here?" "Yes," she replied, trying to hide her embarrassment. His interest was unexpected, but pleasant. From that day on, he came almost every week, looking for an excuse to buy a bouquet or just to talk. He loved listening to her stories about flowers, laughing with her and joking that she was the only reason he fell in love with flowers. Their meetings became more and more frequent, and each time they discovered new facets in each other. Oliver talked about his life at the estate, about how difficult it was to live in a world where money and prestige were at the forefront. He was not like the rest of his family, who considered their superiority untouchable. Lilia became more and more fascinated by him, feeling their connection grow into something more. One day, as they were walking in an old park, he suddenly stopped, took her hand and said, "Lilia, I know we're different, but I want to be with you no matter what." Her heart sank as she realized that these words were not just a declaration of love, but a promise that their relationship was ready to withstand any challenge. When Lilia thought back to those happy days, she couldn't believe how much her life had changed. She remembered her first dinner with Oliver in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. He was touchingly attentive, he told her stories about his childhood, laughed heartily, and looked at her as if no one else existed in this world. They discussed their dreams and plans, and even when he talked about the difficulties of living in the Graham estate, Lilia felt his authenticity. "My mother thinks I should marry her business partner's daughter," Oliver said once, looking away. "But I can never be happy with someone I don't love." His words rang true, and Lilia felt a warmth spread through her body. She knew they had a difficult path ahead of them, but she believed in the power of their feelings. One evening, when Lilia came home from work, she saw her parents sitting at the old table. George was intently reading a piece of paper, and Elizabeth was trying to remain calm. "Mom, Dad, what's wrong?" asked Lily, coming closer. "It's a letter from the Graham family," George said slowly, looking up. "They invite us to dinner at their estate." His voice sounded distrustful and worried. Lily felt her heart begin to beat faster. An invitation to dinner at the Graham home could mean anything. "Oliver said he wanted to introduce us to his parents," she said, trying to contain her excitement. But something about the look on her parents' faces made her uneasy. The next evening, when the Wilson family approached the Graham estate, the huge gates and lighted windows of the mansion made Lilia feel uncomfortable. They passed through the massive doors, where they were greeted by servants and led into a magnificent hall. Everything around them radiated wealth: expensive carpets, gold-framed paintings, and sparkling crystal chandeliers. Lilia felt like an outsider in the midst of all this glitter. Oliver rose to meet them, his eyes shining with warmth, but his demeanor was tense. Next to him stood his parents, Lady Victoria Graham, who held her head high, and Lord Henry Graham, who had a stony expression. Victoria looked at the Wilson family with a cold smile that immediately made it clear that this meeting was not a joyous occasion for them. "Lilia, it's good to see you," she said with a subtle note of irony in her voice. "Oliver has told me a lot about you." Lilia could barely contain her excitement as she responded with a polite smile. After a few minutes of polite conversation, Victoria finally got down to business. "We are here to discuss the future," she said, looking at Oliver. "This concerns not only you, but our entire family." Lord Henry leaned forward, his stern gaze breaking through Lily. "Oliver, you know there will be consequences to this marriage," he said, emphasizing every word. "We cannot allow our family's name to become part of a low society." Oliver sighed and stood up, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Father, I have already made my choice. I love Lilia and I will be with her, regardless of your reservations." Victoria looked away, and Henry's eyes flashed with rage. "If you choose this path, don't count on an inheritance, on our support, on anything." His voice became cold and ruthless. The next few minutes passed in tense silence. Lilia felt the atmosphere in the room thicken. For the first time, she realized how deep the divisions between their families were and how difficult a choice Oliver had to make. When the meeting was over and the Wilson family was returning home, Lilia could not hold back her tears. It seemed to her that the world was beginning to fall apart. But at that moment, she also felt how much she loved Oliver and was ready to fight for them both. Lilia sat on an old chair in her room, looking at the moonlight coming through the thin curtains. Her thoughts circled around Lord Henry's words, his cold gaze, and his ruthless terms. She could feel a wave of fear and despair rising in her chest. Her father George, who never complained about hardships, looked confused and exhausted this time. He knew that losing his job at the factory owned by the Grahams meant putting the whole family on the brink of survival. A sudden knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her mother, Elizabeth, with a warm smiling face that hid her concern. She came into the room and sat down next to her, hugging her daughter. "We're not going to let them win, Lilia," she said, looking quietly into her eyes. "Your happiness is more important than anything else." The tears Lilia had been holding back all evening began to slowly roll down her cheeks. "Mom, I don't want you and Dad to suffer because of me. I love Oliver, but I don't know if we can overcome this wall his parents have built." Elizabeth sighed and put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. "True love always faces obstacles. But you are strong, my girl. And you are not alone." Meanwhile, the family council gathered at the Graham estate. The living room with its high ceilings and marble columns was filled with muffled voices and tension. Oliver stood by the fireplace, trying to hide his nerves. Opposite him, Lady Victoria sat with an indifferent expression, and next to him was Lord Henry, clutching a newspaper with the news, not even looking at his son. "Oliver, you must understand that this marriage is a disaster for our family," Victoria said, her voice ringing with emphatic restraint. You know how important it is to maintain our reputation. I don't need your money and reputation if I can't be happy, Oliver replied, trying to remain calm. Lily is my love, and I'm not going to give her up just because of your prejudice. Henry stood up, throwing the newspaper on the table. His eyes glittered with anger. You talk about love like a boy dreaming of an imaginary world. Our life is built on rules and compromises. And if you decide to go against your family, you'll go with your bare hands. Oliver felt his fists clenching desperately, but he forced himself to remain calm. He looked at his mother, trying to find some support, but instead he saw only indifference and coldness. I have made my choice, he said with quiet determination. And if I have to, I'm ready to start all over again without your support. Victoria exchanged a look with Henry, her face stony. She realized that the situation was getting out of hand. Then, son, you are responsible for your own decisions, she said, trying not to show her emotions. The room fell silent. Oliver felt both despair and relief wash over him at the same time. He knew that this step would change his life forever, but at that moment he was only thinking about Lilia, who was worth all the sacrifices. When he returned to his room, he dialed the phone and waited for a familiar voice to come through on the other end. Lilia, I've made up my mind. I'm leaving everything for you. We'll make it together, I promise. On the other end of the line, Lilia was silent, tears of joy mixed with anxiety. Their journey was just beginning, and the obstacles were only growing. The next few days were full of anxiety and anticipation for Lilia. She knew that Oliver's decision to leave his family would not go unnoticed. Neighbors and acquaintances began to spread rumors of an unexpected conflict between the young Graham heir and his family. It seemed that every glance in her direction was filled with distrust and condemnation. One evening, as Lilia was packing up her things after working in a flower shop, her best friend Anna approached her. Her eyes were full of concern and support at the same time. Lilia, I heard that your affair with Oliver caused a storm in his family, she began, choosing her words carefully. It's true, Anna, Lilia sighed, putting down the flowers. They are doing everything they can to ruin our plans. But I can't back down, not now that we've come this far. Anna sat down on the bench next to her, hugging her friend. You've always been strong, but be careful. The Grahams do not forgive those who turn against them. Lilia nodded, realizing that Anna was right. She knew that from now on, her life would change forever. That same night, as she walked home along the narrow path that led through the park, her heart suddenly began to beat faster. In the darkness, she saw a silhouette approaching her. It was Oliver, his face illuminated by the moonlight and his eyes full of worry. Lilia, we need to talk, he said as he approached. He took her hands, and she felt them tremble. My parents, they've gone even further than I could have imagined. My father has contacted old friends to stop us from getting married. They are trying to use all their resources to put your family in a difficult position. Oliver's words were like a punch in the chest. What do you mean? What else can they do? Asked Lilia, not letting go of his hands. They're threatening to disrupt our wedding by putting pressure on your father. My father has already threatened to fire him and convince the other owners not to hire him, Oliver explained. He sounded helpless in his voice. He knew that this time they were facing more than just a family disagreement. Lilia was silent for a few seconds, digesting what she had heard. Then, gathering all her strength, she answered, We knew it would be difficult, Oliver. But I won't back down. We will find a way, I believe in it. Oliver looked at her with gratitude and love. We have to act quickly. I know a lawyer who can help us protect your family's rights. He has worked with people who have been victims of powerful people like my father. After a short pause, Lilia spoke again, I'm not afraid, Oliver. I know that our feelings are worth all these trials. Her words sounded resolute, like a promise she made not only to him but also to herself. Meanwhile, the Graham estate was filled with tension that was palpable even in the air. Victoria was sitting in her study, nervously tapping her fingers on the carved table. Henry stood by the window, looking out at the dark garden that stretched out in front of the mansion. "He won't listen to us, Victoria," Henry said, not taking his eyes off the night skyline. "Our son has decided to turn against his family, and now we must decide how to proceed." Victoria sighed, pushing a strand of hair back. "Perhaps it's time to show him that real power belongs to those who don't hesitate to use it." The night brought with it restlessness. Lilia couldn't sleep, listening to the wind outside the window. Her thoughts revolved around everything that had happened. She knew they were in for a rough ride, but she couldn't have predicted how much Oliver's family would resist. The next morning, when she woke up, she was greeted by her mother's worried face. "Lilia, you need to know what happened," Elizabeth said, her voice concerned. "Your father. George was told that he no longer works at the factory. The Grahams kept their threat." Lilia felt her heart sink. She knew that her father's dismissal was only the beginning. The family was now not only in danger of losing their steady income, but also facing public stigma. News traveled fast in the small town, and everyone was already whispering that the bride's father had disgraced his family. "Mom, I have to go to Oliver. We have to find a way to stop this," Lilia said, feeling a mixture of fear and determination overwhelm her. Elizabeth took her daughter's hand and looked into her eyes. "We will get through this together. But be careful, Lilia. The Grahams are dangerous people." Lilia nodded and left the house, heading for the small cafe where she and Oliver usually met. She walked quickly, not noticing the curious glances of the neighbors. Oliver was already waiting for her, his face pale and his eyes full of struggle. "I heard about your father's dismissal, Lilia." "I'm so sorry," he said, pulling her into a hug. Feeling his warmth, she forgot about the rest of the world for a moment. "We have to act, Oliver. Your parents won't stop until they destroy everything we hold dear." Her voice trembled, but she sounded stubborn. Oliver nodded. "I met with a lawyer. He's ready to help. We can protect your family and show them they have no right to do this." "And what if it doesn't stop them?" asked Lilia, looking into his eyes, where anxiety was intertwined with hope. "Then we'll go further, we'll go to the press, we'll raise the public. Their power is the fear they sow, but if people know the truth, they won't be able to break us so easily," Oliver replied, his voice determined. While they were planning their actions, the situation at the Graham estate was heating up. Henry and Victoria discussed the next steps. They were ready to do whatever it took to regain control. "I won't allow us to be embarrassed. We need a new approach," Henry said, clenching his hand into a fist. "Maybe we're being too soft, Henry," Victoria added, her gaze as cold as ice. "It's time to show what we can do." His mother's words were Oliver's last wake-up call. He knew his parents would do anything, even the dirtiest tricks. They needed a plan to ensure that Lilia and her family were protected before the Grahams made another move. A few days later, the lawyer presented the case of Henry Graham's illegal actions. It caused a significant stir in the town. People began to say that even the richest cannot go unpunished. But Henry and Victoria were not going to sit idly by. One day, when Lilia was returning home, a man in an expensive suit met her at the gate. "Allow me to introduce myself, I'm Martins, an advisor to the Graham family," he said with a fake smile. "I've been instructed to pass on some important information to you." Lilia tensed, sensing something bad was coming. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "My boss asked me to tell you that your father will be given his job back and compensation paid, but only if you stop trying to marry Oliver," he said, watching her reaction. Lilia realized that this was their next move to separate them. But a new and decisive fire had been ignited inside her. She knew that her decision would affect not only her, but her entire family. Now the game was entering a decisive phase. The wedding day arrived, but it began under a heavy haze of tension. Lilia woke up before dawn, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She had mixed feelings, joy and excitement that she would become Oliver's wife today, but also fear of what the Graham family had in store for them. Her mother, Elizabeth, was helping her get ready, nervously straightening the folds in her wedding dress. "You look incredibly beautiful, Lilia," she said, trying to smile through the anxiety written all over her face. Lilia stared into the mirror, seeing her reflection, and felt her heart overflow with emotion. She nodded to her mother and took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. While intense preparations were underway in the Wilsons' small house, the Graham estate was a completely different spectacle. Guests gathered under the high arches, dressed in their finest attire, exchanging graceful pleasantries. Lady Victoria controlled every detail with her characteristic coldness, while Lord Henry stood a little to the side, holding a glass of champagne, his face impenetrable. "This will be the day we take back control," Victoria whispered to Henry as she turned to him, her eyes moving through the crowd, searching for Oliver. When Lilia and her family arrived at the church, the crowd of wealthy guests turned to look at the newcomers. The feeling that she had walked into a room where everyone was against her was unbearable, but Lily gathered herself and stepped forward, supported by the gaze of her father George. His eyes told her of support and love, despite all the threats and difficulties. Oliver stood at the altar, a smile lighting up his face when he saw Lilia. She was his hope, his light in the darkness, and he knew that the fight they were fighting was worth every moment. Lilia was approaching him, and he reached out to embrace her with his eyes. However, the silence in the room was tense. The guests whispered, exchanging skeptical glances. Lady Victoria sat in the front row, her face stony, but her eyes glittering with cold anxiety. The priest began the ceremony, and the room fell silent. Lilia and Oliver held hands, their eyes meeting and speaking of love and determination. Nothing seemed to disturb this moment, but suddenly the church doors opened with a bang. All heads turned to the entrance, where a tall man in a dark cloak stood. "I apologize for the intrusion, but this cannot wait," his voice was clear and confident. It was Sebastian Grant, a former police captain known in the city for his unwavering principles. His arrival caused a wave of whispers among the guests. Lady Victoria froze, and Henry stood up straight, his face obscured by a shadow. "What's going on here?" The priest's voice was nervous. He turned to the newcomer, but Sebastian came closer to the altar, holding a thick folder of documents. "This ceremony cannot go on until the truth is told," he said, casting a stern look at Henry. "Lord Henry Graham, you are accused of serious crimes, including corruption and murder, which have been covered up for years." A wave of shock and surprise erupted. The guests exchanged glances, many of them standing up to get a better look at what was happening. Lilia felt her legs go cottony and her hands get cold. Oliver immediately grabbed her arm, trying to give her support. Henry took a step forward, his face crimson with rage. "This is nonsense. You have no right to come here with such accusations," he shouted, his voice trembling. "I have all the evidence I need." Sebastian opened a folder, showing the guests' photos and documents. "Your power and money will no longer be able to cover up your crimes." Victoria tried to stand up, but her movement was slow, as if she had lost control of her body. The guests began to fuss, some of them rushing to the exit, fearing that disclosing further details would call their reputations into question. The silence that followed Sebastian's words was deafening. Lilia felt her heart pounding as if it were ready to jump out of her chest. The guests, who had been confident and respectful just a few minutes earlier, now looked scared and confused. All eyes were on Henry, whose face was turning pale by the second. "This is some kind of mistake," said Lady Victoria sharply, rising from her seat. Her eyes shone with anger, and her voice sounded sharp and cold. "We will not allow you to slander our family on this important day." Sebastian was not going to back down. He raised his hand, showing the documents he was holding. "This is not slander, Lady Victoria. This is evidence. For years, Lord Henry has used his position to enrich himself illegally and cover up his own crimes. There is evidence here to prove his involvement in the murder of former police captain Jonathan Lowell." The room exploded with noise. The guests shouted, stepping back. Lilia felt her legs trembling, but Oliver was squeezing her hand, his eyes still fixed on his father. "Dad, tell me it's not true," he said, his voice quiet but determined. Henry leaned forward, his eyes clouded with hatred. "Son, you have no idea what you're talking about. This man is a madman." He took a step forward, but Sebastian blocked his path. "No, Henry, you won't get away this time," he said, his voice rattling with iron determination. "There are witnesses, there is evidence. And today, everyone will know the truth." Victoria turned pale, her hands trembling. She realized that their world had shattered like a fragile vase that had been broken into hundreds of pieces. The guests gathered in the church were no longer witnessing a festive ceremony, they were witnessing the fall of the most powerful family in town. Lilia felt her legs give out, and she leaned against Oliver, who was trying to keep his cool. "Is all this true, Oliver? Tell me this is a mistake," she whispered. Oliver summoned all his courage and looked into Lilia's eyes. "I didn't know about this, but, if Sebastian is telling the truth, we have to accept it. We can't build our lives on a lie." Suddenly a voice came from the back of the room, "He's right. I am a witness." An elderly man with a heavy look and tired face came to the center of the room. He was one of the former workers at Graham's plant, whom Henry had once fired for knowing too much. "I was there the day it happened. I heard the conversation when Captain Lowell threatened to expose their schemes, and I saw Henry leave his office shortly before the captain was found dead." The man's voice sounded firm despite his obvious fear. There was a murmur among the guests. This was no longer just a wedding ceremony, it was a scene of truth that no one had expected. Victoria took a step back, looked at her husband with horror, and sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "Henry, did you really do it?" Her voice broke, and she looked like a broken woman who had lost everything she had. "Shut up!" Henry shouted, his face flaming with anger. But he was no longer the figure of power and strength that everyone knew. He looked defeated and weak, surrounded on all sides by irrefutable evidence. Oliver, hugging Lilia, took a step forward. "Father, it's over. We can't hide the truth any longer." Sebastian signaled to the police officers standing at the entrance. They came over to take Henry into custody. He did not resist, just looked at his son with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "You're going to regret this, Oliver," he whispered as he was led out of the church, and the crowd parted before him as if he were a ghost who had lost his power. Lilia looked at Oliver, and their eyes met. She felt tears slowly rolling down her cheeks. They both knew that after today, their lives would never be the same again. After Henry Graham was escorted out of the church, the atmosphere remained tense. Guests continued to whisper, some rushing to the exit to avoid further scandals. Lily and Oliver stood side by side, holding hands, silently watching as the echo of the truth broke down the boundaries that separated their worlds. The priest at the altar looked puzzled. He cleared his throat and, trying to restore order, said, "The ceremony can only continue if you wish. But I understand if that is not possible today." Oliver looked at Lilia, her eyes glistening with tears, but there was something more in them, strength and determination. She nodded, confirming her decision. "We came here not only for the holiday, but for the truth," she said, addressing Oliver, and then turned to the priest. "We are ready to continue." The remaining guests fell silent, watching the young couple. Oliver took Lilia's hand in his voice firm and calm. "Today we have witnessed the revelation of a truth that has long remained in the shadows. But even in the darkest moments, the light of truth can lead us to a new beginning. Lilia, I promise to be your support at any time, in joy and sorrow, in moments of victory and loss." Lilia smiled through her tears. She felt her heart fill with warmth and hope. "I promise to be by your side, even when the world around us is falling apart. Our love is what will help us get through any trials." The priest continued the ceremony, and this time it was special, not because of luxury or wealth, but because of the sincerity and real emotions that surrounded the young people. The words of the vows merged into a single whole, and when the priest declared them husband and wife, the room fell silent, filled with respect and support. Some of the guests applauded, while others remained serious, contemplating how the events of the day would change their understanding of the world in which they lived. At the exit of the church, Lilia and Oliver faced a new obstacle. A crowd of journalists had gathered at the entrance stairs and immediately began filming the newlyweds and asking questions. Ms. Lilia, how do you feel after today's events? Oliver, how do you plan to act after your father's arrest? The questions came one after the other, leaving no room for a response. Oliver, holding Lilia's hand, raised his other hand, signaling that he was ready to give a short answer. Today we have witnessed not only a wedding, but also the beginning of a new era where truth is more important than influence and money. We will go through this together and show that change is possible, he said, then gently hugged Lilia. There was a noise in the crowd, and Sebastian Grant came to the fore. He approached Oliver, his face full of respect. You have taken an important step, son. Your bravery will not go unnoticed, he said, shaking Oliver's hand. Thank you, Captain, Oliver replied. Your help made all the difference. Lilia realized that they had just embarked on a new journey that was filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. Their hearts were heavy from their experiences, but they knew that together they would overcome any challenge. At that moment, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the newly married couple. They exchanged glances, and the promise they had made to each other to continue to fight, to believe and to love, no matter what, shone in their eyes. The remaining guests began to leave, discussing what had happened and carrying with them the echoes of the secrets revealed. Some remained silent, while others spoke of Oliver and Lilia's courage. But one thing was clear, this wedding will be remembered for years to come as the day when truth triumphed over lies. The day that began as the most important in Lilia and Oliver's lives ended with the explosion of a scandal that shook the entire town. After Henry's arrest, the Graham family lost their immunity. But this was only the beginning of an investigation that promised to uncover even more secrets. When Lily returned home after the guests had left, she felt tired and devastated. Oliver stayed by her side, supporting her, but his eyes showed disappointment and sadness. He felt that the world he had lived in for many years had been built on deception. Meanwhile, an oppressive silence reigned in the Graham estate. Victoria sat in the dark hall, looking at the portraits of her ancestors, which now seemed to her only symbols of a past that would never return. Her hands trembled as she recalled Henry's last words to Oliver and how things had spiraled out of control. I always knew it would end badly, she whispered, bowing her head. In that moment, she realized that the only thing she could do was to protect her son from the consequences that had already begun to affect him. The police and investigators continued to investigate. Everyone in the city knew that the extent of the corruption and crimes Henry Graham was accused of could be much greater than expected. News spread at an incredible rate, and everyone was trying to figure out what would happen next. Amidst all this turmoil, Sebastian Grant did not stop. He collected new evidence and verified the information he received. He knew that Lilia and Oliver's safety was now at risk, as Henry's enemies might want to take revenge for the exposure. A few days after the wedding, the police unexpectedly arrived at the Graham estate with a warrant for an additional search. Victoria watched as they turned over every room, looking for evidence. She remained silent while her thoughts were focused on one person, Henry. Finally, when one of the officers came out of the office holding a locked safe, Victoria couldn't take it anymore. "What are you looking for?" she asked, her voice firm but tinged with fatigue. The officer looked at her, not hiding his disbelief. "We are looking for documents that will confirm your husband's financial fraud," he answered briefly. The officer's words made Victoria think. Her eyes fell to the safe, which had not yet been opened. What could be in it? Perhaps something that would change the course of the investigation? She didn't know, but she felt that this would be a turning point. At that moment, a figure appeared in front of the house that caught everyone's attention. It was Marian, a longtime family friend who knew their secrets but always kept quiet. Her face was focused as she slowly entered the house. "Victoria," she said as she came closer. "I know it's hard, but you have to make the right choice. Your son and Lilia are the only things that matter now." Victoria looked up, and her eyes filled with tears. "Marian, I don't know what to do. Henry was always strong, he always found a way. But now everything is different. And you know that sooner or later the truth comes out, Marion replied, touching Victoria's shoulder. The echo of her words filled the silence of the room. Victoria realized that the time for protecting her and fighting to maintain her own power was over. Now she had to protect her son. Here is the second part of the chapter, the denouement, approximately 7,000 characters. As the searches of the Graham estate continued, a wave of suspicion and discussion grew like a tsunami in the city. Lily and Oliver, in their home, felt the walls steadily closing in around them. Their lives were now under a microscope, and their every action raised new questions. Sebastian Grant, who had become a trusted ally in this battle for justice, appeared on their doorstep with the news. His face was worried, but his eyes showed unwavering determination. "Lilia, Oliver, you should know what we found," he began, sitting down at the table in the small living room. "During the search of your father's estate, we came across new documents that could open up a whole chain of crimes, including bribery of officials and hidden accounts abroad." Oliver frowned as he listened. "Does that mean the consequences will be even greater?" "Yes," Sebastian confirmed. "But there is something else important. We found letters signed by Victoria, in which she warned Henry of the possible risks and urged him to stop." Lilia looked up in surprise. She knew? And she still kept quiet? "It looks like she was trying to stop him, but she was also protecting her family," Sebastian explained. Now this could change the course of the investigation and become additional evidence in court. At that moment, the living room door opened and Victoria appeared on the threshold. Her face was tired, her eyes red with tears. She stood silently looking at her son and Lilia, as if trying to find the right words. "I need to talk," she said quietly. Sebastian nodded and stood up, making room for her. "Oliver, Lilia," Victoria began, her voice shaking but full of determination. "I know I've seemed indifferent and cold all these years, but I've always had your protection in mind. What happened was unforgivable, and I realize I can't keep quiet any longer." Oliver looked at his mother carefully, feeling mixed emotions, anger, confusion, but also compassion. "What do you want to say?" he asked. "I have to testify against Henry," she said, clenching her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I know it may cost me everything, but it's the only way to save you, son. I cannot allow the shadow of his crimes to fall on you and your future." Lilia looked at Victoria, feeling her heart clench with compassion. She saw before her not just Oliver's strict mother, but a woman who realized that it was time to fight not for power or status, but for her loved ones. Sebastian took a step forward. "This is a bold step, Lady Graham. Your testimony will be important to the investigation and may possibly mitigate the sentence for you personally." Victoria sighed, her gaze resting on Oliver. "I'll do it for you. I will do this so that you can live with a clear conscience and not be afraid that the past will catch up with you." Oliver came closer to his mother and hugged her for the first time in many years. It was a brief moment of reconciliation that meant more than words. But this moment was overshadowed by a sudden noise from the street. Sirens sounded somewhere far away, and everyone in the room listened intently. The sound was getting closer, and it soon became clear that the police had arrived again to take the others involved into custody. The door of the house opened and officers entered. They stopped in front of Victoria. "Lady Graham, you will need to come with us for further questioning," one of them announced. She nodded without resisting and stepped forward with her head held high. Her gaze lingered on her son once again. "Don't forget that I have always loved you, even when I was wrong," she whispered. Before Oliver could respond, the officers led her out of the house and the door closed behind them. The room fell silent, heavy and uncomfortable. Lilia walked over to Oliver and took his hand. "We will get through this together," she said quietly but with confidence. Oliver squeezed her hand, grateful to have her by his side. He knew that there were many more challenges ahead, but now they were ready to face them together, supporting each other like never before. When Victoria was led away, Oliver and Lilia were left alone in the silence that engulfed the house. Sebastian approached them, gently putting his hand on Oliver's shoulder. Your mother has taken a big step. It shows her strength and love for you," he said, looking at the young man with deep respect. "I never thought we'd get to this point," Oliver replied, his voice full of sadness and relief at the same time. "But if that's what it takes for the truth to prevail, I'm ready." Meanwhile, back at the police station, new interrogations began. Victoria sat at a table in a small interrogation room, her face a look of determination mixed with a shadow of regret. The interrogator, a tall middle-aged man with piercing eyes, sat down across from her. "Lady Graham, do you realize that your testimony is important? It could change the course of the entire investigation," he said, looking at the papers in front of him. Victoria nodded. "I understand. I know I kept quiet for a long time, and I realize it was a mistake. But now I'm ready to tell the truth." The first few hours of interrogation were difficult, but Victoria continued to speak, revealing details of Henry's machinations, his connections to influential people, and the bribes he paid to protect his position. Her testimony began to put together the puzzle of all the facts that Sebastian and the other investigators had been gathering. Meanwhile, back in the city, news of the investigation and Victoria Graham's testimony spread quickly. Residents couldn't believe that one of the wealthiest families had suffered such a collapse. Some sympathized with Oliver, knowing that he was not involved in his father's crimes, but others looked at him with suspicion, wondering if he really knew nothing. At that moment, Lilia decided to act. She realized that they needed to restore Oliver's reputation and show the town that they were willing to fight for the truth. Together with Sebastian, she organized a small press conference where Oliver could express his position. Journalists and locals gathered in the square in front of the city hall. Cameras were shining, recording every movement. Oliver, dressed in a simple but elegant suit, took the stage. Lilia stood by his side, her support visible and strong. "Thank you all for coming today," Oliver began, his voice calm but full of strength. "I know that many of you are disappointed and surprised by what has happened. I am, too. None of us chooses the family we are born into, but we always have a choice about who we become. I am here to state that I have nothing to do with my father's illegal actions. I am ready to cooperate with the investigation and help cleanse this city of corruption." The journalists started asking questions, some of them harsh and ruthless, but Oliver answered honestly and directly. Lilia could feel his words awakening hope among those listening. People were beginning to realize that the young heir to the Grahams was ready to change not only himself, but everything about his family. At that moment, a man appeared in the crowd and caught everyone's attention. It was one of Henry's closest associates who had tried to hide after his boss's arrest. His eyes were full of panic as he shouted, "Do you think the truth will save you?" Henry had friends who have not yet said their last word. Sebastian reacted instantly, drawing attention to the officers who were present for security. The man was detained, but his words left a wave of anxiety behind. Lilia looked at Oliver, and their eyes met. They knew the danger was not over. The sun was setting over the horizon when the event ended. People were leaving, discussing what they had heard, but Oliver and Lilia remained on stage, watching the city change right before their eyes. Their fight for the truth was not over, but they knew they now had the support of those who believed in them. After the press conference, Lilia and Oliver returned home, feeling tired and stressed from the day that had changed their lives forever. Everyone realized that the struggle for justice had only just begun, and that new challenges lay ahead. Meanwhile, at the police station, Victoria continued to testify. Her stories were becoming more and more detailed, and the investigators realized that Henry had not acted alone in his actions. Every word Victoria said opened up new avenues for the investigation, and among the names she mentioned were those that shocked even experienced investigators. These were influential people who used their connections to cover up crimes. Against the backdrop of this information, new arrests began. The police detained several key figures who had previously been considered untouchable. The media did not stop discussing the case, treating it as the biggest corruption scandal in recent years. All eyes were on Oliver and his family. Lilia, meanwhile, tried to support Oliver by helping him cope with the public pressure. They both knew that the time when they could just live their lives was over. But they also realized that this struggle would make them stronger. One evening, as the sun was setting over the horizon, Sebastian knocked on the door of their house. He looked worried and a little tired. Lilia immediately noticed his mood and invited him in. "There is news," he began, sitting down at the table. "Your father, Oliver, is trying to use all his connections to avoid the harshest sentence possible." He started talking, revealing information about the people he's been working with. Oliver remained silent, watching Sebastian. His eyes showed a mixture of anger and fatigue. "Does this mean he can get a lesser sentence?" he asked. Sebastian nodded. "It's possible, but it depends on how much truth he reveals and how valuable his information is. But there is something else. Victoria has asked to see you. She wants to talk to you before she's moved to another location for further investigation." Lilia squeezed Oliver's hand lightly, supporting him. He thought, realizing that this meeting might be the last before a long separation. "I'll go," he finally said. The next day at the police station, in a specially prepared room, Oliver met his mother. She looked tired, but the coldness that had once been so familiar had disappeared from her eyes. They sat opposite each other, and silence hung between them, as if filling the space of all the unspoken words. "Oliver," Victoria began, her voice calm and gentle. "I'm not going to apologize, because I know that apologies won't fix what happened. But I want you to know that everything I did was in the hope of protecting you." Oliver leaned forward, his eyes intent. "Mom, I know what you were trying to do. But now we both realize that lies and secrets don't protect you, they only destroy you. I hope that after all this, you will find peace and forgiveness for yourself." Victoria closed her eyes, and tears slowly flowed down her cheeks. "Thank you, son. You have grown into a real man, and I am proud of you. No matter what." Their conversation was short, but it was very important. It was the moment when they both realized that the end of this story did not mean the end of their relationship. It was an opportunity to start again, albeit with a huge burden on their hearts. When Oliver left the ward, Lilia was waiting for him. She saw how he had changed a bit after the conversation and smiled as she hugged him. "Now we can start a new life," she said, and he returned her sincere smile. But they knew that the road to peace and liberation from the past would be a long one. And there was a trial ahead, where the fate of Henry and his associates would be finally decided. After all the testimony was given and the charges against Henry and his accomplices came into full force, the lives of Lilia, Oliver, and their loved ones began to change. The city was no longer the same. Everyone looked at them with different feelings, some with sympathy, some with judgment and distrust. Lilia sat in the kitchen of her old house, where she had spent most of her life. There was a silence in the air that used to be soothing, but now felt like a harbinger of a storm. Her mother, Miriam, came over and put a cup of warm tea in front of her. "Everything is going to change, daughter," she said, stroking Lilia's hand. Her eyes reflected anxiety, but also the strength she held for her family. "I know, Mom," Lilia replied, taking the cup and staring into the rising steam. "But are we ready for this? Are we ready for a life that we have never even imagined?" At that moment, Oliver entered the room. He looked exhausted, but there was a fire of determination in his eyes. "We've been offered entry into the Witness Protection Program," he said, sitting down next to Lilia. "It means we can start over, away from the threat and past mistakes." Lilia looked up, her gaze fixed on Oliver. "But what about our families? What about everything we know?" "It's a difficult decision," Oliver continued, "but it's the only way to guarantee our safety. Henry had many enemies and many more allies who will not stop to protect their interests." Sebastian appeared in the doorway. He was wearing his usual sharp suit, but this time he looked a little softer. "I realize this is difficult, but believe me, it's the right choice. The Witness Protection Program will provide you with new names, new documents, a new life. It will be hard, but this is your chance to start from scratch." Miriam took a deep breath and looked at Lilia. "We always knew this fight would not be easy. But we have to think about the future. Your future and the future of your children. Lilia felt a mixed feeling of fear and hope arise in her heart. She saw Oliver squeezing her hand, his support unwavering. No matter how hard it is, we will make it. We're in this together, he said, his voice firm, though slightly shaky. The decision was not an easy one. Lilia knew that leaving everything she knew and loved was tantamount to losing a part of herself. But she also knew that the safety of their family was more important than all the memories and connections. The following days were filled with preparations. Agent Sebastian helped them with the paperwork and explained the process of adapting to the new conditions. Miriam and the rest of the family received instructions on how to move and the rules of their new, hidden identity. Every moment was permeated with an invisible tension that reminded them that their lives had been completely different until recently. Change is always scary, Miriam said, sitting next to Lilia in their old living room. But I know you're strong. You'll be able to get through this, and we'll be able to build something new and better. I try to believe that, Mom, Lilia replied, squeezing her mother's hand. At that moment, Oliver entered the room with an envelope in his hands. These are our new documents, he said, showing them their new passports and ID cards. They were not just paper proof of new names, but symbols of a new beginning. Lilia stared at her new name. It was strange to see herself under a different name, but she knew it was necessary. The last glimpse of her old life was full of pain, but also of confidence that something else, perhaps even better, was waiting for them. The following days were filled with chores and heavy emotions. Packing became a symbol of saying goodbye to the past, with each item reminding them of happy and painful moments. Lilia stood next to an old family photo album, flipping through the pages that showed moments of her childhood, holidays, and important events. Tears glistened in her eyes as she saw a photo of her father, who had once been an example of courage and kindness to her. It's harder than I thought, she admitted as Oliver walked over to her and gently put his arm around her shoulders. I know, he replied softly. But we have to look forward. It's the only way to stay strong. Miriam watched them, trying to hide her emotions, but tears broke through her protective barrier. You are both my pride, she said, and I believe that new happiness lies ahead for us. When the day of the move finally arrived, the streets that had been so familiar seemed somehow foreign. The sound of the agent's car pulling up to the house made everyone gather in the lobby. Sebastian was as serious as ever, but this time his face reflected an understanding of the importance of this moment. Everything is ready, he said, holding the door open. Your new homes are waiting for you, and we will do everything we can to make the adaptation process go as smoothly as possible. Oliver helped Lilia and Miriam into the car and sat next to them, watching their home disappear into the distance. His heart was heavy, but he was also relieved that they were finally leaving all the danger behind. When they arrived at the place where they were to be temporarily housed, the atmosphere was low-key. It was a small house on the outskirts of the city, where nature seemed peaceful and calm. Lilia got out of the car and breathed in the fresh air. She felt a new hope emerge in her soul. This won't be easy, Sebastian warned her as he got out of the car and held a folder of documents in his hands, but you must understand that what matters most now is your safety and the beginning of a new chapter in your life. Lilia nodded, feeling his support. We are ready to try. I know there are many unknowns ahead, but we will not be afraid. That's the right attitude, Sebastian said. The first steps are always the hardest, but it gets easier with time. Miriam was the first to enter the house, her face filled with both sadness and relief. She immediately began to arrange the place, trying to make it feel like home. Oliver and Lilia came up to her, helping her put things away. We've come a long way, Oliver said, pausing for a moment to look at his family, but this is just the beginning. Now we have to live for the future. Lilia hugged him, feeling the warmth of his presence. We will create a new history. And this time it will be filled with truth and love. The first days in the new place were not easy. Each member of the family tried to find their place in this new world, where everything was different, from the people around them to the rhythm of life, which had nothing to do with the past. Lilia could feel her homesickness slowly giving way to new hopes. The old house they now lived in was small but cozy. It had old wooden floors that creaked with every step, and large windows that let in soft sunlight. Miriam quickly set about furnishing her new home, adding details that reminded her of the happy days of old. One evening, as darkness enveloped the city, Oliver sat on the veranda, gazing up at the starry sky. Lilia sat next to him, leaning against him. Their hearts beat in unison, and the silence between them was full of quiet understanding. "Do you know what I was thinking?" Lilia said, breaking the silence, "that maybe all this happened for a reason. Maybe we needed this stroke of fate to see how much we can change and change our lives." Oliver nodded, squeezing her hand. "We have become different. I am different. And although the pain of the past still echoes in our hearts, we can build something new. And it won't be the life we left behind." The next day, Sebastian arrived at their home with the documents to finalize their new identities. "This is the last step before you can officially start your new lives," he said, handing Lilia and Oliver envelopes. Lilia took her envelope and looked at the new name printed on the documents. It looked unfamiliar, but it was gradually becoming her new reality. Oliver looked at his papers as well, his eyes intently studying each line. "You are now Karen and Thomas Morelli," Sebastian said with a smile, trying to bring a little lightness to a difficult moment. Miriam sighed softly as she watched the children holding these symbols of change. "It will be hard, but we are together. And that's what matters," she said, hugging Lilia. Sebastian said goodbye, leaving them with thoughts and new perspectives. The evening brought with it a new realization: although the past remained a heavy burden, they now had a chance to build something of their own, away from shadows and fears. Lilia and Oliver sat together, looking at their new names, and felt that the moment of acceptance had finally arrived. "There is still a lot of work to be done," Oliver said, looking into her eyes. "But now we know we can overcome it all together." "Yes," Lilia replied, smiling gently, "and this time it will be different." 3 years had passed since Lilia and her family left their old life behind. Now she lived as Karen Morelli, in a small coastal town where life was slow and quiet. The town, with its narrow streets and white houses, was drenched in the scent of salt air and fresh flowers. Karen worked in the local library, helping children and adults find books that became their friends in the quiet evenings. Her days were filled with new faces, conversations, and activities. She learned to enjoy the simple things: morning coffee on the balcony, the smiles of library visitors, and walks along the beach as the sun slowly disappeared behind the horizon. Yet even in her moments of greatest joy, Karen felt the shadow of the past. The memories of the day everything changed, of the events that led them to this new life, never left her. She remembered Oliver's face, his support, and the promise they had made to each other, to always move forward, despite all the difficulties. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight flooded the room with soft light, Karen got ready for work. There were going to be readings for children at the library, and she had prepared several fairy tales that she was excited to read aloud. Over the years, she had learned to find peace in simple pleasures, and this work brought her pleasure. The little children had already gathered in the library, their faces shining with anticipation. "Karen, tell us a story about a brave hero," exclaimed one girl with curly hair and big blue eyes. Karen smiled, sat down on a small chair in the center of the circle of children and began to read. As the last lines of the story disappeared into thin air, the library door opened softly. A young man entered with a friendly smile. He was a new teacher at the local school who had recently been appointed. His name was Daniel, and he quickly gained the sympathy of the locals with his friendliness and good nature. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," he said when he spotted Karen and the children. She just smiled back. "It's okay, Daniel. We were just finishing up." Daniel came closer, holding several books in his hands that he wanted to return. He looked at Karen, and his gaze was filled with genuine curiosity. They had become friends over the past 3 years, but there was always a line that Karen kept between herself and others. "Great reading," he said as the children began to disperse and the room was filled with their laughter and commotion. "Thank you," Karen replied as she gathered up the books. Her heart still bore the marks of the old wounds, but she felt that she was slowly beginning to recover. And although the past was still with her, she had learned not to let it rule her life. The evening sun was gently sinking below the horizon, coloring the sky in golden-orange hues. Karen stood on the terrace of her house, gazing out to sea. The waves rolled calmly onto the shore, creating a rhythmic sound that always soothed her. She could feel herself slowly releasing the tension that had been building up throughout the day. She heard footsteps in the distance, and soon Daniel appeared on the terrace. He was holding 2 cups of hot tea. "I think you could use some rest after a day like that," he said, handing her a cup. Karen smiled and accepted his offer. They sat down next to each other on the old wooden sofa, which creaked under the weight. Their silence was not awkward, but rather reflected the deep, unspoken understanding between 2 people who were gradually discovering each other. "I see how much you work with children," Daniel began, leaning forward slightly. "You are like a friend to them, and that is very valuable. You know they adore you." Karen looked at him with a bit of surprise. "I'm just trying to do the best I can. They give me joy, and I think I help them find something good in the world." Daniel thought for a moment, his gaze becoming more serious. "Karen, I know it's hard for you, that behind your smile there is a lot of unspoken things. But you are strong, and I hope that someday you will tell me your story." Her heart sank at these words. Karen knew the time would come when she would have to open up to someone, but she wasn't ready yet. Still, Daniel's presence made her feel safer than she had in years. "Maybe one day," she replied softly, taking a sip of her tea. The sea was reflecting the last glimmer of the sun, and the silence between them was full of promise for the future. Karen felt something changing inside her, slowly and imperceptibly, like the tide. The memories of the past were no longer as painful as before, and she began to believe that there was a possibility for new happiness. The next few days passed in a familiar routine. Karen continued to work at the library, interacting with patrons and spending her evenings on the terrace with her book. One evening, as she was returning home, Miriam approached her. There was a warmth in her eyes that always gave Karen strength. "You're doing well, daughter," she said, hugging her. "I know it's not easy, but you're growing up and finding your place in this new world." "Thank you, Mom," Karen replied, hugging her tightly. "I feel like I'm finally starting to live, not just exist." Miriam looked at her with pride. "And you have the right to do so. Your past doesn't define you, it's just part of your story. And now you are writing its continuation." Karen looked at her mother's face, and her heart was filled with confidence that she was on the right path. The past would always be a part of her, but now she saw an opportunity for a future full of light, new feelings, and acceptance. A few more months passed. Karen felt that her life, although difficult, was beginning to take on new colors. Her days were filled with work, socializing with friends, and the moments of peace she loved so much. Daniel was becoming an important part of her life, although she still kept some boundaries between them. One morning, Karen decided to take a short trip to a nearby town to enjoy a change of scenery and spend some time alone. She took a bus, and a few hours later she found herself in the market square, where life was bustling with joy and noise. The air was filled with the smells of baking, fresh flowers, and spices. Sitting down on a bench under a sprawling chestnut tree, Karen thought about how far she had come since the day she first arrived in this city. She remembered the painful moments when she had to make difficult decisions, the sense of loss and fear of the future. But now, as she looked at the people passing by with smiles on their faces, she felt something new, confidence that she had found her way and felt alive again. "Karen," a familiar voice made her look up. It was Daniel. He was smiling, holding a basket of fruit. "What are you doing here?" she asked in surprise. "I could ask the same thing," he replied with a smile. "I thought you might need some company." They smiled together, and Karen felt her heart grow a little warmer. They spent the rest of the day together, enjoying the simple moments, laughing, walking through the narrow streets, talking about everything. It was the day Karen felt her heart begin to open again. She realized that the moment had come when she could leave the pain of the past behind and focus on the future. The evening sky turned dark shades of purple and blue as they stood on the bridge, watching the city lights reflected in the water. Daniel turned to Karen, his eyes full of sincerity. "Karen, I know you've been through a lot. And I don't want to put pressure on you, but I would like to be a part of your life if you let me." Karen was silent for a moment, letting his words sink in. She took a deep breath and replied, "Daniel, I want that too. I still have a lot to learn, but you have already become an important part of my new beginning." They stood side by side, and Karen felt a wave of relief and happiness wash over her. The past was still with her, but now it was a part of her story that helped her grow and move forward. She knew that there would be many more difficulties and challenges ahead, but now she had the strength and support to cope with them. The city was filled with the sounds of nightlife, and Karen felt her heart fill with warmth and peace. She turned to Daniel and smiled. "Thank you for finding me." "Thank you for letting me find you," he replied, and their eyes met, reflecting understanding and new hope. "Thank you for sticking with us to the end of this story. We always appreciate your support and your attention. If you liked this story, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. We'd also love to read your comments. It really inspires us to create more for you. We apologize for any mistakes. The text is voiced by artificial intelligence, and our team continues to learn to make your experience even better. We wish you inspiration and good moments in your life. See you soon.